Yale Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quadcast, a Yale Divinity School podcast series focusing on issues related to religion, culture, and politics. In this episode, YDS alum Emily Judd interviews Abdul-Rehman Malik, an award-winning journalist and Yale Divinity School lecturer on Islamic studies. In the episode, he describes the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, observed by over 1 billion Muslims around the world.
Ramadan is meant as a time where, you kind of deny the body, but free the spirit.
He discusses the secret history between Islam and coffee and how coffee was popularized by Muslims in Yemen who used coffee to stay awake for nightly prayers.
The coffee fruit was originally chewed raw by the mystics and the Sufi orders.
And Malik also weighs in on the rising trend of Islamophobia and argues against the idea that violence is inherent to Islam.
For the vast majority of Muslims, their faith is a vital part of their desire for peace.
You teach two courses at Yale Divinity School, the first being Foundations of Islam, Understanding Muslim Tradition, Practice, and Encounter, and the second being Islam at the Intersections, Readings in Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Liberation. What motivated you to teach Islam at a Christian divinity school?
Well, first of all, Emily, thank you so much for having me today and for this conversation. I felt like having the privilege to design a course on introducing Islam to Christian seminarians essentially was an opportunity really for me to communicate and provide a space in which we could discuss the essence of Islam, to look at Islam in the modern world, but also to understand it from the inside out, and to have a confessional Muslim teaching that not merely as a subject, but really as we do at YDS, as scripture, as something that is connected to the divine was an incredible opportunity. And if I feel like students leave the class with an appreciation for Islamic faith, culture, spirituality, and history, and this is all they ever learn about Islam, but they're going to go out into a multi-faith world, my hope is that they'll take some of that essential knowledge with them, which will give them the tools for cultural and religious literacy in an ever-changing and ever-diverse United States.
I'm very happy to hear it because actually myself, I came to the Divinity School, Yale Divinity School in 2016 with the desire to learn about my own religion, Christianity. And it wasn't until I believe 2017, I took the course that was being taught at the Divinity School, Christian-Muslim Dialogue, with the late Professor Lamin Sana. My whole universe changed. And I was dedicated now to Christian-Muslim relations after this class. And that's actually what I still do in my work. Like you said, many people probably have never been exposed to Islam if they're coming from a Christian background. Muslims are only 1% of the population in the U.S., so I think it's very important work that you're doing. And I'm curious your thoughts. Why should Christians in particular learn about Islam?
I think writ large in the world today as faith communities, the encounter between Islam and Christianity, I think amongst interreligious encounter is special. It's special because the two faiths share so much. There's such affinity in our faith traditions. I believe the approach of the Prophet Muhammad, who spoke about the affinity between Christian and Muslim, who spoke about defending the life, the property, the religious institutions of Christian people, to the extent that in one narration he said that I am at war with anyone who violates the sanctity of the monastery or the church.
The holy month of Ramadan, which is a holy month in Islam, is quickly approaching, and it's a time of fasting, prayer, and reflection for Muslims all over the world. I think there's over 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. Why is Ramadan so important to the Islamic faith?
It's a month where, for the duration of 29 or 30 days, depending on the sighting of the moon, Muslims will engage in fasting. We won't eat or drink or engage in intimate relations from the rise of the sun to the setting of the sun. Ramadan is meant as a time where, you kind of deny the body, but free the spirit. Ramadan is a time of charity It's a time of giving. It's a time of service. While in the Muslim majority world in particular, time takes on a different feel. The days slow down, the nights become alive. Here in the United States and elsewhere where Muslims live as minorities, we continue to be part of the fabric of the societies which are ours, our communities, our neighborhoods, engaging with our friends and neighbors who are not Muslim. And we layer on top of that this kind of sacred duty and responsibility. But ultimately, Emily, the wonder of Ramadan really is incredibly personal, because, to be honest, if I felt hungry, I could go into my room, close the door, take out a Kit Kat, enjoy it, have a glass of water, wipe my face, look pious, and walk out of my room, and no one would know that I've broken my fast. There is an intimacy that fasting builds between you and the divine.
You were part of a documentary that examined the relationship between coffee and Islam. So in addition to being a professor, you're also an award-winning journalist. So in this BBC documentary, you traveled to Turkey to explore the relationship between Islam and coffee. Can you tell us, what is the secret history between Islam and coffee?
The history of the cultivation and the brewing of coffee as a social beverage it entirely finds its beginnings in the Yemen. Coffee originated in the Horn of Africa, particularly in modern-day Ethiopia, but it was first cultivated as a fruit that was to be turned into a beverage in the Yemen. And it was in the Yemen that it gained social popularity, because initially, when the beans came over a period of several hundred years, plants were brought from Ethiopia over the Yemen across that narrow body of water between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The coffee fruit was originally chewed raw by the mystics and these Sufi orders who found that in chewing the coffee fruit, they would get incredible energy and a buzz to stay awake for their nightly devotion, so they could stay up all night in worship and in prayer and in the remembrance of God. And eventually, they started to boil and to make the coffee fruit into a tea, and eventually roasting the beans and turning that into a beverage. So there was a point in time, Emily, where all the coffee in the world, cultivated coffee in the world, came from the Yemen, and it was under the authority of the Ottoman Empire by then. And eventually,
so what year is this about?
So we're looking at the cultivation of coffee in the Yemen starts in the 1400s. By the early 1500s, coffee has started to travel along caravan routes to places like Mecca, Damascus, Cairo, and eventually Istanbul. By the end of the 1500s, we find the emergence of the first cafes in places like Damascus and eventually Constantinople, Istanbul, where coffee really becomes a culture and an art form. And we see the invention of the coffee house is as one of the scholars of the history of coffee notes, that the coffee house itself is entirely in character and in vision what he calls a Muslim institution, a place of hospitality and preparation. So the coffee house itself becomes this kind of institution outside of the usual places where people meet and interact. In the Turks used to call it the extension of one's living room. It was one's living room outside the house where social discourse could take place. And eventually, through the machinations of colonial powers and the Dutch East India Company and the French East India Company, the plant was eventually taken to colonial outposts like Reunion Island, to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and eventually to Java. And these now become places where coffee, of course, we associate coffee with. So there's an incredibly rich history, and so it's an obsession of mine. I could talk about it for hours, about coffee and its history and the power of it as a social beverage.
Many research reports have found that Islamophobia is on the rise globally. including in the United States. I'm wondering, have you faced Islamophobia personally? And if so, how did you respond to it?
I think, for me, it's interesting because I think there's been many moments in my life where I think I've directly been confronted because I appeared Muslim. I remember that I think one of those experiences that really shaped me was when I was in university. This is in the mid-90s, and it was shortly after a terrible period of violence in the Holy Land. And during my university years, I'd been very active in interfaith work, Christian, Jewish, Muslim work. Also very active after the Oslo Accords and sort of supporting the two-state solution in the Holy Land. And so it was an issue that was close to my heart. And I remember I was in lineup at a Starbucks, and it was the day after a terrible attack in Tel Aviv, where many individuals had died, and what we would term a suicide attack. And it was also on my heart and mind, and as a young person, maybe just 20 years old, deeply disturbed by that. Also working through, this phenomenon, which little did I know much later in life I would be very fully engaged with, and in terms of looking at and understanding. And this gentleman turned around in line and looked at me, and I remember I had a bit of I had much much closely cropped beard in those days, but I was wearing what I always used to wear, my Afghan hat, which was sort of a signature hat of mine, and I was wearing a kafia. I was wearing my Palestinian scarf. And he turned around and said to me, "Do you have a bomb in that bag?" And he said it very loudly, so the entire cafe heard. And there was this kind of murmur and quietness. And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Do you have a bomb in that bag? Are you here to kill us?" And I just remember my face going hot, and just, it's a 20-year-old, wanting to swear and shout and take him outside for a drag 'em, rock 'em, sock 'em. But I generally was not that kind of person. But I think there's just like a shocking moment. And I think the shocking moment was two things. One, that someone would say that. And the second thing was the silence of all those people around, and you think to yourself that, yeah, you know what, my whole life has sort of been defined around this sort of dangerous Muslim other. And of course that grew after 9/11. And, Emily, since the mid 90s, I was really engaged in the work of sort of, community work, but also the work of sort of revising traditional Islamic pedagogy and education and connecting ourselves, particularly to the spiritual tradition. So groups like Al-Qaeda and individuals like Bin Laden were anathema to my Islam. But I think I myself realized, in university and beyond that, religion can be weaponized in so many ways. And it can be a force of manifest good, and it can be weaponized for harm and for violence. So I think I had to recognize at a very early point that there were those who wanted to weaponize Islam just as people want to weaponize other faith traditions for violence and to do harm. And I think 9/11 was that kind of moment for us, where these individuals, I could say that they're not Muslim, but that would really be, I think that would be unfair almost. These people called themselves Muslim.
Exactly.
They said,
yeah, I've heard, certain Muslim leaders say when they are asked, is this extremist truly Muslim? Or, and some of them will say, who am I to judge that? I'm not the end all be all of who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim. But you can say, and many, many, many Muslim leaders have said, but it's not covered enough in the media, condemning acts that don't represent Islam.
And that was clear to me, from the very beginning, that not only the condemnation, but later on, people like Professor Kurtzman and his book, The Missing Martyrs, spoke about, like, if violence like this is so endemic to Islam, why aren't there more suicide bombers, right? Why aren't there more people martyring themselves for Islam? The truth is, and the Gallup research that was led by Dalia Mogahed and other researchers, in the earlier 2000s, confirmed this. Islam, Muslimness, Muslim values, ethics, morals have scaffolded Muslim responses to global injustice. For the vast majority of Muslims, their faith is a vital part of their desire for peace.
You're the director of the Muslim Leadership Lab, which is an innovative project being incubated at the Dwight Hall Center of Social Justice at Yale. The goal of this lab is to cultivate a new generation of American Muslim leaders who are serving the common good at Yale and beyond. How does the lab go about achieving that goal?
The lab has just been such a wonderful kind of generative space. No 2 years have been the same as we continue to try new ways of doing things. That's why we call it a lab. This year, we're getting ready to start at the end of this month. We're going to run through Ramadan. We felt that was important, Ramadan being a time of sort of spiritual training. The lab essentially is intended to allow students a space to gain the skills, confidence, and context to be proudly Muslim and to be proudly engaged fully in the societies and the communities, the neighborhoods, and the context that they live in. Our goal with the lab isn't to create American Muslim leaders who serve American Muslim interests. That would be far too narrow. Our goal in the lab is to cultivate and to give vision to these bright, intelligent, I would say incredibly experienced, many of them students, to have the confidence to be Muslim in whatever they do, and to know that serving the common good means serving their communities and serving God. And all of them are going to find different ways of doing that. The time is over, I think, in religious communities for parochial leadership, for narrow-minded leadership. It is a time of convergence. It is a time of being present in society, of being faithful, of living your ethics, of joining hands with others, because the fault lines are deep. The crisis is real, and we've experienced that in these pandemic days in ways that we never thought we would. So this year, for example, we're going to be organizing around a series of masterclasses where we're highlighting particularly Muslim women of color who are at the front lines of community organizing, of politics, of policy work, and encouraging our students to almost engage in a fishbowl style with them, to have these opportunities for these grassroots frontline leaders who are working in all walks of life to be able to share from the worlds of journalism, politics, policy, community organizing, arts and culture, to be able to talk about what does leadership look like as a self-identifying Muslim within the space that they're in, and to give an opportunity for students to deeply engage with the process by which the skills of that leadership have been built. It's incredibly gratifying for me. And
I can imagine.
And I hope useful for those who've participated.
It's amazing. Your experience at Yale is training both Christian young leaders and then also Muslim young leaders. So your work is in itself serving, all people. So that's amazing.
I appreciate that, Emily.
And I just want to thank you so much for giving us time today to talk about Islam on many different topics: Islamophobia, Islam and coffee, Ramadan. So thank you so much for all of your insights.
No, I really appreciate it, Emily. YDS has become for me a really special space, and I would say a sacred space. There's a lot of amazing things that happen in the Quad, and around the quad. And I know it's students like yourself who make that happen. So shout out to all of you who give life and spirit to this place. The faculty do a great job, but I think it's the students of this place who really make it what it is.